So our final session is on the future safety net, the need for effective public institutions. And the reason we put this on the agenda is that the reason we're here is the Nuffield Foundation exists for change. We start very much from this proposition, which has been a dominant theme of the conversation so far, about the power of evidence to change lives. If we can confront people with the truth about what's really going on in our society, then we have a much higher chance of making better decisions. And that's what we're all about. But sometimes the mechanisms for producing the evidence, the capability for producing the evidence isn't there. And sometimes the levers that enable that evidence to be turned into better practice, better policy decisions, and better outcomes for people, which I think has come through in every single intervention we've had today, don't exist. So a wonderful part of being a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation is we can choose where to put our money. And we have a very proud tradition of investing in institutions. I thought I'd just run through a few before introducing myself and the panel. So the first, which is very dear to my heart and very valuable to me in my day job at the moment, is the creation of the Constitution Unit over the way. I can't think which way is west, I think it's that way, over at UCL. Creating a body that can create the evidence base to have a sensible discussion about the Constitution, if that's even possible, but what are the balance between the three levers of government? How do we function, how do we manage the institutions that make up the core of the state? So in helping to found that organisation, we have generated a new body of evidence that can be instrumental in changing people's lives. Another one of long standing in the Nuffield family is the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. And that's been going away for a very long time, but its value at this moment, when the intersection between science and human biology is changing all the time, what is it possible for us to know and influence about what makes a baby, what makes us human, what is actually happening to us at the end of life, what are the ethics of all this, is suddenly centre stage. And that institution can now be a trusted voice to be on the political stage when those vexed decisions have to be made. Another one of long standing is Full Fact, where we've been a long standing funder of Full Fact because there were lies out there. There was no one out there checking the comments, the data that was being used by politicians and others. Full Fact has been instrumental in creating a fact-checking industry, which I think is serving us well, particularly in the weeks we're currently in, and is working alongside amazing institutions like BBC Verify and the UK Statistics Authority, to name but two. But in supporting Full Fact to create that institution, but also to create a more vibrant industry, is something we feel very proud of. And more recently, we've created two further institutions, which I think are very much of the moment. So the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, I see Lisa Harker sitting right in front of me as the director of that organisation, trying to link evidence and practice, but most significantly, giving a voice to those who are most dispossessed in our society. The children who struggle because of family breakdown, or because of a life in care, because they have no other family. Who's speaking for them? People subject to deprivation of liberty orders. What's really going on? How do we understand what's happening? The FGO is a unique voice in that landscape. And finally, the Ada Lovelace Institute, and Fran Bennett also is here. 6 more days with us. We're going to get every hour's worth of value out of you before you head off for the next stage in your career. But that really has been an institution of the moment, looking at the ethics of AI particularly. This new thing that can be such a powerful force for good in our society and add so much to the enrichment of our lives and the success of our economies. But boy, can it do some bad stuff too. Who's thinking about that? The Ada Lovelace Institute certainly is. So the Nuffield is very proud of our role in supporting institutions. But our panel this afternoon will be looking quite broadly at our public institutions and what state they are in. So this interests me particularly. So I'm John Pullinger. I'm a trustee of the foundation, but I'm also chair of the Electoral Commission. And we're having quite an interesting moment at the moment about how this election is playing out. How much public confidence is there in the way the vote is counted and the way it's run? And on July the 5th, how readily people are accepting the results in each of the 650 constituencies around the country. So strength of institutions really matters in that kind of space. But if we had to have good institutions, they have to be strong, they have to be trustworthy, they have to be inclusive, and they have to be effective. They have to be strong because often they are a small player sitting in the middle of some very big, powerful players. And often their job is to speak for the powerless. And if you're speaking for the powerless in a room full of powerful people, you are very vulnerable. And so they have to be strong enough to be able to cut through when the little person's voice needs to be heard. In an industry context, where there is a cartel developing that is trying to squeeze out competition, how do you protect the new guys who are coming up with something new from being squashed by the big players? In a situation where you are, well, I think Clare will tell us about citizen advice, almost the ultimate example of people without power having to have someone they can turn to that is strong enough to come up with a remedy to the situation they are in. They have to be trustworthy, and we've had so many crises of trust recently. I'm not going to talk about politics just at the moment, but the post office being perhaps the most salient example here. Unless they have the right to be trusted by operating in a way that is open, transparent, ethical, honest, really standing up for the values they purport to espouse, then they are nothing. How do we make sure there is that trustworthiness embedded in the DNA of each of those institutions that we look to stand up for us? They have to be inclusive. And I think increasingly there are people who are shut out because they're run by white men in suits. It doesn't look like them. Because they put the boundary around the service they offer to the easy bits and miss out the bits that may be a bit more expensive or difficult to deal with. How do we make sure we really are bringing in all of the people that institution really ought to be serving? And I think probably the Electoral Commission is a good example at the moment. How are we making sure that everybody who should be registered to vote is registered? And by the way, got 1 week today to get registered. If you're not, spread the message, tell everybody they should be on that electoral register. We have 8 million people in Britain who are not. And they're specifically very large numbers of young people, very large numbers of people in private rented accommodation because they're moving around and never quite get round to it. That's just not good enough. In fact, that was the phrase I used to the last Select Committee. It's not good enough. That is not an inclusive electoral system. But they also need to be effective. And Robin Banerjee talked about accountability in his presentation this morning. And I think effectiveness is all about being accountable for keeping up to date with what your community really needs from you. Having the skills to learn from how well you've done in the past, particularly if you've not done terribly well, but also then to change and adapt and be ready to support the community as it requires you to support it now. And I think a particular feature that came up from Deborah Cadman's comments just now is work together with others. It's about a system, an ecosystem of institutions that are working together rather than against each other. It's all about being effective or the individual communities you're trying to serve, rather than just resting on a particular legal framework or a particular mission. To be effective, you have to work for people. And that brings me back to our panel this afternoon. We have a wonderful panel, and I hope we'll have a wonderful discussion. I'm confident that we will, if what's gone before is anything to go by. And I'll do a little bit of introduction to each of them. So first is going to be Dame Clare Moriarty, who is Chief Executive of Citizens Advice and leads the national charity and network of local Citizens Advice charities across England and Wales. She was previously a civil servant for nearly 35 years, latterly as Permanent Secretary of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from 2015 to 2019, and the Department for exiting the EU until its closure in 2020. There are a whole lot more things I could read out about Clare, but Clare is a good thing. We know each other very well, and you're very welcome, Clare. We look forward to hearing from you. Once Clare has given her keynote presentation to us, I'm going to invite Professor Diane Coyle Professor Dame Diane Coyle to speak to us. And Diane is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, where she co-directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads research under the themes of progress and productivity. Her latest book is Cogs and Monsters, What Economic Is and What It Should Be, which looks at how economics needs to change to keep pace with the 21st century and the digital economy. Diane is also many other things which are on the CV, which I won't read out here, but again, Diane and I have worked together on many things in the past, and I think she will be very provocative and challenging to us, and I look forward to that also. And finally, at University College London, Director of the Centre for Microeconomic Analysis of Public Policy at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and co-director of the James N. and Kathleen D. Stone Centre on Wealth Concentration, Inequality and the Economy. His research interests include labour, development and public economics, and his work has been published in many leading journals. He's also President-elect of the Royal Economic Society and Vice President for the European Economic Association. And I think Imran also will be very provocative and generous with his insights with us. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of them. I guess you are too. So I should vacate the podium and invite Clare to come up and give us her keynote speech. Clare.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today and to join you for such an important conference. I don't think any of us will have anticipated but it adds an urgency to today's discussion. We're living in an insecure society, a society that has been made more insecure by the legacy of the crises of the last 5 years. At Citizens Advice, we're still helping over 7,000, helping people with over 7,000 cost of living issues every day. And what people are telling us in their thousands is that it's living standards that should be defining this election. I'm sure many of you do work or have worked closely with Citizens Advice, or at least know our name, whether that's our policy and advocacy work or our advice delivery. But I always find it helpful when I'm talking to people just to give a little bit of a flavour of what we do, because there's a lot of our work that goes unseen. We are a federated charity with almost 250 members across England and Wales. Each of our members is an independent charity, able to make their own decisions about how they offer their services, while we, as the national charity, provide direction as well as national support and key infrastructure. Others are small, they might just cover a single rural district or town. Each of them delivers a unique mixture of services that are deeply informed by local needs. But all of them are united by our shared purpose to shape a society in which people face far fewer problems. Before joining Citizens Advice, as John said, many years and worked in a whole variety of departments, including health, transport and DEFRA. And so that experience on both sides of the coin has given me a particular insight into how our public services can work and what the consequences are for citizens when they don't. I should start by saying that I retain a profound belief in the power of public institutions to improve lives. There are thousands of public servants who every day show enormous commitment to serve people in often extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I have an even stronger belief that public services are enhanced by partnerships, particularly with third sector organisations like my own, although that is sadly rather less in evidence. People are 5 times more likely to say that charities understand the issues faced by people like them than the government does. Yet, charities are rarely around the table when decisions are made. The social sector makes up just 10% of the membership of government department advisory boards, and it's a figure that becomes much smaller still when you look particularly at departments focusing on the economy. One of the things we understand better than most public institutions is the complexity of people's lives. At Citizens Advice, one of our fundamental principles is looking at people holistically. If someone comes to us with a debt problem, they very likely will have a work problem or a welfare problem or a housing problem as well, or all 3. Those problems can't be treated in isolation. The interaction between them is too important to take a narrow view. We also know that people's problems are becoming more complex over the recent years. Yet that complexity is only rarely reflected in how public institutions approach their problems. Policy making in the UK is all too often driven by the myth of the rational economic actor. It assumes that people will respond in a rational way to economic incentives and disincentives, and thus policy aims will be delivered. The logic goes, decrease the universal credit taper rate so that people can keep more of their earnings, and increase the number of hours that they have to work before being released from an obligation to look for more, and as if by magic, people will work more hours, reducing the benefit bill. Impose sanctions for insufficient job hunting activity, and claimants will find jobs. My experience, and that of citizens advisors up and down the country, is that belief in this type of rational economic actor is profoundly misplaced. I don't mean that people are irrational, rather that the complexity that our advisors see every day can't be washed away just by fiddling with economic levers. One of the least asked questions in policy-making circles is, why didn't that turn out the way we expected? The answer is usually that there are hidden incentives in play that turn out to be more important than the carefully constructed tools of policy. For people in poverty, their deep-seated social, economic, familial, personal and human considerations will surely override whatever the financial incentives are pushing them to do. And when they inevitably do, the consequences are often severe: destitution, homelessness, days in court. It seems obvious, or should seem obvious, that if you're having to worry about where the next meal is coming from or whether you can keep the lights on and your medical equipment functioning, you have little cognitive bandwidth left over to grapple with acquiring new skills or even just looking for work. Yet we still persist in this approach. This problem is in evidence in many parts of government decision-making, but of particular concern to us right now is the field of disability rights and benefits. A recent report from the Health Foundation forecast that the overall number of working-age people experiencing major illness will grow from 3 million to 3.7 million in the next 20 years. That's growth that's driven overwhelmingly by illnesses intimately related to deprivation and poverty: diabetes, COPD, chronic pain, anxiety, depression. The challenge can't be wished away. Indeed, it's here with us now. Disabled people and those with long-term health conditions are among the people most let down by public services. A key metric that Citizens Advice has been focusing on over the last 2 years relates to a phenomenon that we call negative budgets. Every year, we conduct tens of thousands of in-depth financial assessments as part of our debt advice work. This data allows us to track the proportion of people that we help with debt advice whose monthly expenditure on essentials is higher than their income. It's an incredibly powerful tool because it allows us to see the potential impact of policy change on both the income and the expenditure sides of the equation. It also lets us track in high detail the differential impact on different demographic groups. By all of these measures, disabled people and those with long-term health conditions are particularly hard hit. In 2019, a debt client with a long-term health condition had an average surplus after paying their essential costs of £16 a month. That's not much, you might think, but it gives you a little sliver with which to try and address your debts and at least some small hope of not being dragged even further into debt. In 2024, that figure stands at a deficit of £34 a month. Some of this is to do with the wider cost of living crisis. The number of people in negative budgets has been rising across the board, and rising costs combined with stagnant incomes are making those deficits deeper. But it's undoubtedly true that those people experiencing ill health suffer disproportionately. People in debt with health conditions have lower incomes, about £150 a month less than people without them, according to our data. Not only that, but in many areas they also face additional costs. Our analysis suggests that people with long-term health conditions spend an average of £162 a month on health and care costs. For disabled people, that rises to £265. In the here and now, people facing ill health and who are disabled experience the raw end of some of the dysfunctions of public services. Go to any local system device and ask about the most common problems faced by people coming to us for help, and I guarantee that personal independence payment will be right up there. Every month we help tens of thousands of people who are seeking advice on the subject. Rising ill health is one reason for the prevalence of this in our service. But another key factor is the design of the benefit itself. A common trajectory is for people to have their claim turned down when they first apply, turned down again at the pre-appeal stage known as mandatory reconsideration, but if they go on to formal appeal, the vast majority see that decision overturned. As someone with a deep belief in the power of public services, I'd like to believe that this is one of the unintended consequences of policy that's driven by adherence to the rational economic actor fallacy. But there are many that see it as an intended consequence, a policy that makes deliberate attempts to make it difficult for people to access services. Whatever the truth of the matter, it has huge impacts. The most recent government figures suggest that the unfilled eligibility value for PIP, that is money that's unclaimed, stood at £870 million. For disability living allowance, the figure is £750 million, a quarter of all claims. You set that against the roughly £54 million overpaid on PIP because claimants didn't report that their condition had improved, or the £10 million overpaid on disability living allowance. Something is profoundly wrong when disabled people and those with long-term health conditions are losing out to the tune of £1.6 billion on support that they're entitled to. Whoever forms the next government will have to deal with the present problems and address the wider societal trend of rising ill health. Worryingly, much of what we've seen in terms of how it should be addressed has fallen into that familiar pattern of the rational economic actor. Decades of reforms in this area have focused on tightening access to support and reducing the value of support for some so that they, on paper, will have greater financial incentives to work. Of getting an employer to be flexible, to make reasonable adjustments. It doesn't stop them facing the loss of crucial support, like a Motability car, because there are severe delays in benefit processing. And it doesn't speed up the waiting time for much needed treatment or surgery. These kinds of challenges exist for many people who receive disability benefits on top of the day-to-day challenges that everyone faces. Prices that seem to go up and up, access to affordable childcare or decent housing. It should rather be a time to think deeply about how our welfare safety net functions and what its purpose is. Spending on disability benefits is forecast to rise by £16 billion a year within the next 4 years, from £39 billion to £51 billion. We're scheduled to be spending more and more on benefits for the wrong reasons. It's time to think differently. One departure point is to rethink how we conceive of the welfare state. We think of it at the moment essentially in a negative framework. It's a cost of failure. In that mindset, the idea of the rational economic actor has a greater pull to minimise those costs. But what if we conceived it as a positive one? What if, instead of designing the welfare system in a way that penalises and disincentivises claiming, it was designed in a way that supported and encouraged people in need? What if, instead of confecting ordeals for people to go through, claiming was a passport into other support that would genuinely help them adapt and move forward? Critics would argue that this would be too expensive, that times are hard and we can't afford it. But the unavoidable truth is that we're going to struggle to foot the costs of failure anyway. The only answer, and as we convene in the middle of a general in the area of disability benefits, there are profound changes that one could make in this spirit. What we need is an enabling state that provides the right levers to help people move forward. It should identify the challenges that people face as quickly as possible, give them options to address these, and support them in taking action. Support should not be either intentionally or unintentionally hidden by making access and eligibility complex. Public services should be organised in a way that reflects the real experiences of those who use them. Good outcomes for disabled people or people with long-term health conditions can't be achieved by the benefit system alone. People are likely interacting with a range of different actors: the health service, employers, social care, occupational therapy services. But they rarely work together, and they often, in fact, counteract each other. So we need to be looking to build a proactive system that brings together the right agencies and institutions as soon as possible. Public services should be together identifying the challenges that people face, finding options to address them, and assisting people in taking action as quickly as possible. Doing less means waiting for people to figure out what support could help and letting their need increase. This relates back to another core element that needs to be embedded in public services, and that's prevention. Citizens' advice is in the problems business. It has been for 85 years, but it's also in the prevention business. One of our 3 missions for our whole service is to do whatever we can to help people resolve their problems as early as possible. Get harder to solve the longer they go untreated. We're all familiar with that old proverb: for want of a nail the shoe was lost, for want of a shoe the horse was lost, for want of a horse the battle was lost. All too often, our advisors are helping people at the point when the battle has already started. Dealing with an eviction notice because someone has fallen behind on their rent, for want of the right advice on accessing the support that they might be eligible for. Calling us from behind a locked door because the bailiffs are parked outside, for want of support and guidance on how to deal with their debts. Or seeking a fuel voucher or a food bank voucher for want of support with paying their rising bills or the right support from suppliers. This has profound implications for our services and for government. People's problems are flowing to the most expensive and often most harmful ends of the system. The courts, accident and emergency, food banks. Our infrastructure is filled with last chance saloons from which there often seems to be no escape. Any public servant of long service will have seen enthusiasm for prevention and early intervention wax and wane. But one of the key lessons of the dual crises of this decade is that the absence of long-term thinking about our social fabric left many people unprepared to face the socio-economic realities of COVID or the cost of living crisis. The broader national crises came on top of and compounded many other long-standing issues. An overdependence on an inadequately regulated private rented market. A debt solution market akin to the Wild West, where regulators struggled to combat misleading claims from debt management companies. An immigration system that locked millions of people with a legal right to work, study and live in the UK out of public funds that they needed to survive. And those are just a handful of the problems that fused with the wider issues at hand. And that fusion led to incredibly desperate circumstances for many that were harder and more expensive to address. In many meetings I have with government, ministers and civil servants talk about resilience. What they often mean is having the physical infrastructure in place to prevent, respond to and bounce back from crisis. But that once again neglects the human at the heart of the problem that we're trying to solve. Public institutions should be at the forefront of building this human societal resilience so that people are as well equipped as they possibly can be to meet moments of personal or public crisis. And it's that human component that I'd like to end on. When public institutions fail to meet their aspirations of changing society for the better, it's so often because the person is not part of their equation. The millions of people that we help every year, each with their own stories, their own lives, their own complexities, happen when that failure public institutions in the service of building a safety net worthy of the name. They must change. I'm not going to pretend it's an easy task, but it is a necessary one. And it can start on days like today. Every organisation represented here will have something. By working in a genuine spirit of partnership, we can, together, help public services provide the safety net that is and will continue to be so desperately needed. Thank you.
Hey, Diane, would you like to give any observations on what you've heard from Clare, but also give any comments of your own? I don't really want to do it from here or up to the podium. If you're happy here,
I'll sit here if that's okay. So thank you so much, Clare. I've been doing that thing of changing what I was planning to say as I listened to you. So I'm an economist and I've been studying the digital economy for many years. And so in my world, at the moment, the whole conversation is about the technology. Including our social fabric. But a lot of the questions are actually almost entirely about the private sector, as if the public sector is still using quill pens. And that seems to me a bit of a puzzle because the public sector is going to have to, and is starting to engage with digital technologies and AI. And there's a bit of a paradox really, because it's a phenomenal communications and information technology. The pace of progress has been astounding. What it can do now, what it will be able to do in 6 months' time is absolutely remarkable. And yet at the same time as this improvement in communications and information, we seem to have a loss of accountability in society, as if the technology is mainly creating disempowering systems. And we'll all have had the experience of going into the chatbot or voicemail hell where you're speaking to a computer and there's a script and it's not answering your questions and you spend hours and hours. There's a term, the time tax, that we're paying for the use of these systems by companies. But public institutions are going to have to start to use digital technologies, partly because of the pressures of demand going up, partly because they're all going to have to reduce their costs and there's cost-saving potential. But also because of the opportunity to make people's lives better. And there is a real opportunity there to save people time rather than costing them time, to improve outcomes in health or education or any aspect of their engagement with the state. But using a technology well is really challenging, and the private sector parallel is instructive because only about 5 or 10% of companies in the UK and other countries have been able to adopt digital technologies to improve their productivity. And there are estimates that it costs about 10 times as much to buy the kit or pay for the services, the digital services in the first place. So it's a challenge. How do you restructure organizations to deliver the better outcomes for customers on the one hand or citizens and residents on the other hand? So what are the challenges then to the public sector in using technology to make people's lives better? Well, the advantages are the same ones. It's the advantages of responsiveness, of speed, of personalization, of being able to respond to the whole person in a holistic way. There are some obvious challenges. One is about knowledge and training. Do people have this in the public? What else might they need to know to use it effectively? There are challenges about good procurement and using that to innovate for public service, and in particular being astute about not signing away rights to data, not doing exclusive deals, not selling the family silver too cheap, and so on. There are also challenges about hierarchies. A lot of public services are quite hierarchical organisations, and for digital technologies to be used effectively, people down the organisation have to be empowered to act on the information, the additional information that they get. In areas like the health service, for instance, that's a real challenge to hierarchy in hospitals because some of the opportunities for better outcomes for patients do depend on handing down that power to use the information. But there are two other issues that I think are quite significant, and maybe it would be worth dwelling on in conversation afterwards. One is that the holistic treatment is really important. People have complex lives, as Clare was saying. Anybody who's trying to help them respond to the challenges they face needs to respond to them holistically. That means joining up information, though, and there are real issues of trust there. We're starting from a position where many people don't trust the public organisations that they're engaging with. The incentives are not aligned, possibly, or they've had the experience of going through the PIP process, whatever it might be. I don't think we start in a good place in terms of trust. And then when you're talking about joining up the information, it's very easy for people in public bodies to understand how well-meaning they are and dedicated to public service, but it might not be the case that the people about whom they are joining up information, who may be extremely vulnerable, want them to do that. So I think the trust issue is a serious one. The other one, and I think it's been less discussed, is that when you're automating decisions using machine learning or AI systems, you're actually using rational economic actors on steroids acting at the speed of light. And it puts PIP assessment problems in the shade. In a way, it's an automated version of all the problems that we saw with target setting in the new public management era. It's called the alignment problem in computer science. It may not be aligned well. There may be straightforward data bias issues. There are also some very subtle data bias issues. And it forces us to think about our objective functions. Because when you're not automating things, first of all, there's room for human judgment, and there's room for fudge. And that's not always a bad thing. In political science, some of you will know they're called incompletely theorized agreements. It can enable people to agree about courses of action without agreeing about fundamental aims. And you can't do any fudge when you're programming a machine learning system with an objective function. You've got to code it to do one thing or the other. Now, I once said this at a computer science conference, and the computer scientist who came on after me said, no, that's no problem. You can just adjust the weights in your objective function so you capture all the things people want. And I'm going, yeah, 52% Brexit, 48% not. You can't really weight that together in a single objective function. So I think there are some very subtle issues there. So the technological affordances, I think, need to be understood. There are constraints. There are also tremendous opportunities. Public institutions do really need to engage with how they're going to use this technology. But I think there are some really substantial research questions to think about how do we ensure that public institutions use public service technology to make people's lives better. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So, finally, Imran, reflections on anything Claire said and your kind of own observations on the topic.
I'm going to be linking back to both what Claire So I just wanted to start by thanking Nuffield for inviting me to be able to present today in front of such an audience. I wanted to follow a very close remit that I was given, which was to think about something that Diane touched upon already, what underpins trust in government, and in particular, think about the functioning of the justice system. I'll come back to describe some new work, a new agenda, Nuffield funded and supported agenda at IFS on the justice. This has been a relatively understudied area of state by the IFS, despite the fact that it's so closely linked with many other areas that IFS has long been working on in terms of education, welfare, labour markets. And part of that is because of the fundamental complexity of life that Claire mentioned and the complexity of vulnerability of individuals. So to start with, I just wanted to put the UK into some kind of context by showing you some data where individuals are asked in a very similar way, representative samples across countries, whether individuals trust their government. And there's lots of different ways we could word this. The wording is comparable across these different countries. And you can see that the UK comes out quite poorly there in this cross-country evidence. It's about 30% of individuals who report in this data that they trust their government. That's very different than countries in Scandinavia, in Canada, and is closer to France, for example. So the ONS actually has some data on trust in governments. We can sort of dig down a little bit more about how trust in the UK varies depending on actors that we're talking about, or here I've highlighted different institutions. So here we see the courts and the legal system in terms of trust in that actually doesn't do so badly. It's only the NHS that has higher levels of trust. And obviously, as we go down the list, we have the media amongst this list that has amongst some of the lowest levels of trust. The ONS puts out comparable statistics when individuals are asked about trust in politicians, trust in academics. I'm not going to show you that data. This is just for... Does any of this matter? Okay, does trust in government actually matter for behavior? And I want to do this through the lens of thinking about behavior during the pandemic. So here's the same source of information where individuals across countries are asked about trust in the context of the pandemic and whether they thought the motive was something that was for the benefit of society, or there were ulterior motives there. And so for a subset of countries, they asked this question. And so you see, for example, if we compare Sweden, which is at the high levels of trust, France, which is much closer to the UK levels of government. In Sweden, we see about 76% of respondents saying they trusted their government's motivations for the imposition of lockdowns during the pandemic. At a country closer to the UK's levels of trust, France, 20% of respondents there said they were suspicious of the motivations, and a further 24% thought that these restrictions were an excuse to control the public. So there seems to be some mapping between trust in government in general and trust in response to particular policies that are put into place. Again, does any of this matter for actual behavior? And so the next slide just shows you, during the pandemic, if we sort of aggregate across European data, what were different patterns of mobility that individuals engaged in around the times of lockdowns being introduced. And so this is sort of mobility, literally tracking the movements of people using mobile phone technologies around the imposition of lockdowns across Europe. And I've just shown you the time series for those individuals who reported before the pandemic trust in government and those who reported distrust in government. And so what you see is that in relation to movements related to retail and recreation, that we might very well say of choices during the lockdown, rather than movements related to work or commuting patterns. Those individuals who reported trusting the state reduced their mobility. They adhere much more to social distancing by a considerable amount more than those of trust in government mapping into behavior time and time again. You find it very starkly in US data currently, but this is across all different European regions. And these are relatively large differences in changes in patterns of mobility based on these political measures of trust. And obviously in the context of something like COVID, just even small changes in how individuals behave can lead to very large differences in subsequent impacts in terms of caseloads that society has to bear. So where does the justice system fit into all of this? Well, it's quite reasonable to think of the justice system as really being one of the fundamental cornerstones of any modern functioning society. It's going to set the rules for how individuals behave with regards to each other, how the state behaves towards individuals, what individuals can expect of the state, how firms will engage with other firms, how they engage with their employees, and many, many other types of economic relationship, whether that's with regards to housing markets that seem to play such an important role for the economic prosperity of the UK. All of those types of relationships that we tend to study, the backdrop for those are set by the rules of the game, are set by what the justice system prescribes. Over and above that, individuals tend to expose the justice system when they're in very vulnerable times or when they have particular needs or engaged in disputes. So the exact moment that we rely on this system to be well functioning are not the average moments in our lives, but typically ones where we're most in need or most vulnerable. Having said that, we might think that those individuals who come into contact with the justice system are a relatively small share of all individuals. Perhaps those individuals who have no contact with the justice system are less concerned with its well-functioning. There I would draw analogies with other spheres of life, that even those of us who are in good health are well aware and concerned about waiting lists for the NHS. When we look at patterns of the business cycle, we see that even in the worst recession, unemployment rates rise to about 7–8% typically. That would be considered a bad recession. If we look at sort of impacts on people's health, there's a far greater share of individuals who are stressed, who are concerned because of the uncertainty that those types of shocks face. And so it's not just the million or so individuals who come into contact with the justice system that may have these concerns. It may be many other individuals over and beyond that. And so what's happened to the justice system in the UK? So the left-hand figure here just shows you real terms changes in departmental budgets over the 2010s, for example, across different areas of government. As Andrew sort of mentioned right at the outset of the day, so other areas are not, including justice, which has seen substantial falls in its total budget. The right-hand side figure is just taken from a new tool, a Be the Chancellor tool that IFS launched a few weeks ago, that allows individuals to then play around with departmental budgets and understand if we spend more on this area of government, we'll have to spend less on other areas of government unless we're willing to change government revenues overall. And so justice is projected to have a budget in 2030 comparable to DWP. It's not a trivial part of government activity, and that's after it's such large reductions in its overall budget. There's also been very widespread and very profound reforms within the justice system that have affected the operation of justice, and this is something that we really want to try to look at in a lot more detail in sort of our ongoing work. So, for example, the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act brought significant changes to the provision of legal aid. It changed who was eligible for legal aid. It changed changed the fee solicitors could charge for even amongst those individuals who are eligible. So as a result, there have been big falls in the funding that's available for various different types of legal advice and support. And this just shows you the time series, the yellow bars for the type of legal aid that's being provided, which completely essentially falls off a cliff around 2013. We don't think the demands on the justice system have changed overnight in 2013. It's just who's paying for it has changed quite dramatically. Does that impact who gets access to justice or who perceives that they're able to take cases to court? It is something that could have profound implications for this cornerstone of society and ultimately feed into trust for the state. I could show you another figure that shows how these patterns have changed around the country. There's a huge pattern of spatial inequalities in the reductions in legal aid, where some areas of the country, the number of individuals per solicitor who's able to provide such advice is very different than in other areas. So these are not, as with many other economic policies in the UK, these are not ones that are spatially neutral around the country. If we think about something that may be very prominent in people's minds, without sort of getting to interacting with the justice system directly, we see big changes in the infrastructure of justice. There's been huge reductions in the amount of spending on courts, but just the physical infrastructure of justice has thinned out in the UK to an extent that probably doesn't get anywhere close to the attention that it should do. So over the 2010s, almost a third of court facilities £, but that meant that the distance individuals have to travel to attend court has also increased quite substantially. Something comparable in terms of police station closures has gone on since 2010. We've had 600 out of 900 police stations having closed. If we want to do the numbers in Greater London, there's been comparable sort of reductions in the number of police stations in Greater London. And so that's doubled the distance that the average household has to the nearest police station, from 1.4 kilometres to 3 kilometres. Does any of that matter? Well, we've done some analysis of what have been the impacts of police station closures, what's been the cost effectiveness to society of having done that. So the first thing that you start to see in that causal chain is that by reducing the number of police stations and increasing the time that it takes for police to attend an event, that's increased response times of the police by about 40%. That's led to reductions in the reporting of crime, and ultimately, as some of our earlier work from a colleague of mine, Elisa Facchetti, shows, that has fed through into changes in the number and composition of crimes that take place. So the final figure there on the right-hand side shows, from the time a police station close to you is closed, what happens to violent crime, for example. Violent crime rises by about 10%. Okay, there aren't many violent crimes, but if we do the cost per violent crime, I think the Home Office estimates are around about £7,000 per crime. And so we can aggregate across different types of crime, look at the total cost of closing that police station, do the benefits of the money that we save outweigh the costs. The answer is a resounding no. Okay, that's just looking at the impacts on the impacts on crime. That's not factoring in two very other important dimensions. One is people's trust in the police, or perceptions of the effectiveness of the police. And that's before you start looking at what happens to house prices, which start to fall around areas as crime rises. Once we include the costs that people are less willing to live in those areas, or those individuals who have houses in those locations, but those houses are now falling in value, the cost-benefit analysis skews even more in one direction. So hopefully, with the support of Nuffield, we've just started a new 4-year program of work trying to look at some of these issues. My co-investigator, Joe Tomlinson from York, is in the audience. Abby Adams from Oxford is also part of this agenda. And so what we're trying to do is bring together social legal scholars, lawyers, economists, to really try to understand some of these issues. And so the broad agenda that we have as part of this 4-year program of work is to see how changes within the justice system have affected both access to justice, the functioning of the justice system. Coming back to the point that Clare raised, we also want to think about how reforms in other areas of social policy, in education, in the labour market, how those have fed through into increasing or changing demands on the justice system as well. The justice system really lies at the heart of that sort of web of state activity, and that's reflected in sort of the multidimensionality or vulnerability that Clare was referring to. And so they're all the things we want to try to put together, how the demands on the justice system have changed, how reforms within the justice system have changed, and ultimately, does this affect people's perceptions of the justice system, and whether we think it's still fit for purpose? And so are the savings that we're getting in the short term really having unintended consequences in the longer term? Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much for that. I mean, I think each of them in very different ways, kind of vivid articulation of just what is happening to people in our society today, and particularly the most vulnerable, but also more generally, the changes we're faced with really are quite deep and profound for all of us and for society as a whole.